Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the 1988 Booker Prize shortlist. So still kind of going through in my plans. I was intending originally to do this in 2023. It kind of just didn't happen, but here we go. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about this shortlist. I'll take the authors in alphabetical order by surname, but start with the winner. Here are 4 of them, and let's get going. So first up, the winner, Peter Carey with Oscar and Lucinda. And Peter Carey then went on to win again in 2001, but this at the time was his first. And particularly, I think I enjoyed this book a lot more than I thought I did. I think I read something else by Peter. I think it was The True History of the Kelly Gang, his other winner, which I was sort of a bit lukewarm about. So I was a little nervous going into this, but I actually really enjoyed this a great deal. The core idea is this sort of couple, these 2 people who kind of come together, Oscar and Lucinda, and they very quickly get into quite a lot of trouble around them, particularly in terms of amassing debts, which come from gambling and from various other things. And their lives look like they're basically going to go south very quickly. They sort of start kind of getting into a lot of trouble, particularly around what that debt then does to them. But at the same time, this is quite a surprisingly funny book. I think it's a very light-hearted and absurd book. I think absurd is probably the word, actually. It's just a book where so much happens, and it's constantly almost camp in how much sort of high drama there is. You know, someone comes in and someone faints, and characters move on, and just this very bizarre, absurd world kind of follows around this book. And so I actually entirely see why it won, because even if it's not my sort of personal choice, I guess, from the list, I think it would probably be second or third. It's such a sweeping, fun book, but also while kind of exploring some quite thoughtful topics. It really kind of goes a little bit into the psychology around gambling, some of the sort of, it has this sort of wide historical reach. It's just, it does a lot and is quite interesting in its way. So I see why it was a winner. I just think it's a really interesting book in many, many ways. And just a fun read as well. So from the longest book on the list to the shortest, Utz by Bruce Chatwin. And so this is particularly dealing with a man who is nicknamed Utz, which is a sort of pejorative name in some ways. It sort of has it's a sort of cutesy name, but it also has a sort of an idea of a bit of a doofus, or a bit of a silly billy, as they say. But he is this figure who, as soon as basically war is encroaching and he sees it coming towards him, so he starts to try and look after various bits of delicate and expensive things that exist. He sort of is trying to make sure that these important things cannot be destroyed. And it's this very sort of odd, lilting book in many ways, sort of there in, I think set in the Czech Republic, if I remember correctly. Yes, yeah, sort of set around, particularly, the Czech Republic and various parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And it sort of deals quite a lot as well within that around sort of Jewish identity in quite interesting ways, where there's a kind of a sense of what you hold on to, and the sort of, what do you want to convey to the next generation? What do you need to make sure survives you? And sort of following on from war, particularly World War II, what will survive for Jewish people to be able to talk about what comes next. So it's a really bizarre book in the sense that it's very lilting, very subtle. It's about 150 pages, but those pages are themselves relatively spare. So it's quite an odd book, because it just sort of happens and then it's gone. But there's something quite profound going on in the background of it. There's this sort of quiet power behind the book that not very much is happening in theory, but a lot is going on sort of in the noise of the rest of the book, sort of outside the book. So yeah, I just found it really quite interesting. And it's a book I'd never heard of before the Booker, and yeah, just really interesting to go back and read. Next up, we have Penelope Fitzgerald with The Beginning of Spring. And I'm just going to sort of start off the top of this and just say, this is probably, I love Penelope Fitzgerald's writing. This is also probably one of my favourites of hers from the ones I've read so far. So I will be gushing about this book. But essentially, the core idea of this is a family who have sort of moved to Moscow. They're an English family, and when they move, there's this sort of them basically readjusting to the world around them and trying to understand things. It's this sort of this sort of married couple, their kids, and just sort of how each of them tries to adjust to Moscow life. There's a high degree of absurdity in this book where some of the characters come up against seemingly immovable objects, but it's really just sort of the bizarre nature of sort of cultural differences, I guess. At one point there's a bear. It kind of, lots of very absurd things just happen in this book. And I think what's kind of interesting is it's not played as the way that we often get these cultural differences where it's sort of, ha ha ha, Russia is so weird. Russia is sort of allowed to be its own thing in the book. And the kind of absurdity comes from the fact that these characters think that they can just move their whole life over and just be English and not come up against anything. There's a sort of, the book almost pokes holes in their belief that Englishness is the correct way and Russia is doing it wrongly. It's sort of the characters trying to understand how on earth they make things work in Russia. So there's a lot of this kind of absurdity and silliness and humour baked into it. But there's also this really strong emotional core in the book of what the characters are doing and how their family structure and the marital structure work and don't work for them. And so what really starts to happen is sort of dark things occur in this book. And so it almost, as well as being quite absurd, becomes this sort of dark, almost crime book at one point. But also these other dark things are going on. And we can sense that something's moving behind the scenes and it's not going to end well as this book plows on and gets sort of further and further towards the, closer and closer towards the end. And I think this is just sort of Penelope Fitzgerald's genius. Like, she's somehow able to balance all of those things where this is, in one way, a very simple story of a family moving, facing some cultural differences and that kind of problematizing things within their family. It's also a really deep sort of dissection of the family unit and of cultural values. It's also this absurd, high drama, high stakes, silly romp at times. It's just doing so much. And I am delighted that this was shortlisted here. It would have been my winner, as you can probably tell. But I think, if nothing else, I'm just glad that Penelope Fitzgerald was mentioned, because I think she, as I'm finding from reading more and more of her work, she's just exceptional at what she does. And she apparently researched really heavily before every book. And for this book, I think had sort of travelled to Russia, or I think had done at least a good amount of reading and studying around Russia. So just this sort of fascinating amount of work going on for this one book. So yeah, absolutely love this book. Next up, we have Nice Work by David Lodge. And this is the third in a trilogy. One of his other ones from this Changing Places was also shortlisted in another year. The trilogy themselves are all kind of campus-based sort of university novels that are satirical and absurdist. You'll notice absurdity coming up a lot in the shortlist. And I have mixed feelings around the trilogy. I overall enjoyed them. I think I found them a little bit too much at times. I think here this book is interesting in its own way. Essentially, the core idea is that there is an academic shadowing opportunity, which involves a character coming to the UK to come to a small town called Rummidge, specifically chosen for its kind of comedic effect. I believe it's not actually a real place. Correct me if I'm wrong. This town is sort of in the Midlands, vaguely somewhere. I think it's sort of depicted in this sort of general out of the way. It's essentially meant to be set up as a slightly boring, well, more than slightly, a very boring town where nothing much happens and where these sort of high-profile luminaries from other universities have come over expecting, to have the best of English education, and they're expecting to be at somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, and instead they're in Rummidge and not much happens and it's all a bit boring. And what the book then sort of does is pokes fun at not only sort of cultural differences between the UK and US, particularly in regards to their academic systems, it also pokes fun at a lot at the kind of academese sort of style language and the ways that professors and lecturers and academics are believed to speak in a way that's entirely divorced from the rest of the population. So you've got this very small university and all of these people sort of discussing these very high level topics and sort of talking in these very grand terms. Meanwhile, the sort of it's meant to almost be that these people are in no ways on top of their own lives. They're sort of falling apart. They're not really, they're kind of claiming to do things. They're sort of, oh yes, this top academic concept, but then they can't really understand how to put the bins out. That sort of kind of level of comedy. And in many ways, lots of this book is very funny, and the whole trilogy has a lot of moments that did make me laugh. I think partly also because I read the trilogy all in one go. I think I was just exhausted by the end and was like, can these characters just stop? But there is a lot of very British sort of comedy and absurdity going on in this book that I found really fun as well. So I see again why it's on the list. But this list, I think probably more than quite a lot of other ones, is one much more focused on humour. These are books that often are just patently absurd in so many ways. And this being a prime example of that. Keeping on with the absurdity, we then have Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. And this is a book that had a lot of its own controversy, and particularly after release, it's sort of gone on to really be a big dramatic sort of turning point in a lot of Salman Rushdie's life. It's sort of part of the reason that there are kind of, that he's been in hiding and been in security for a large part of his life as well. But essentially at the core part of this book, it is a sort of satirical almost look at kind of some aspects of religion, particularly looking at playing around with various ideas around playing around with various ideas in terms of two angels or kind of religious figures on a plane talking to each other about some of the various aspects of religion. That's to really probably sell this book short. Really at the heart of it, it's a wider discussion about ideas of good versus evil, or about religious morals or values. It plays a lot with the idea of freedom, and it sort of plays a lot around with the idea of scripture. And so really it's sort of inviting a lot of discussion. It's a book that at its heart is really playing around with so many big ideas. And there's something, I think it's something I really admire with Salman Rushdie's books. Even if I don't always love the book itself, and actually Satanic Verses I thought was a really engaging read. What I always really admire about Salman Rushdie's work is his lack of fear with just going for big topics and really exploring them in a lot of detail. He has this sort of just complete confidence in going in and exploring topics that would feel quite taboo in other ways, particularly having two religious figures on a plane that has been hijacked, having conversations about the meaning of life and the role of religion within that, and what have you. It's also why, it has been seen by many people as being, by some people as well, as being blasphemous, and that's sort of part of where this book goes. But I think also that's to, in some ways, undersell this book. I think the blasphemy aspect of it, I think a lot of characters come out of this book kind of untouched in terms of criticism. The book is more poking into some of these ideas and kind of exploring conversations rather than mocking the places where those conversations come from. And I think that's what's really interesting about it overall. And last but not least, Marina Warner with The Lost Father. And I was really intrigued when I saw this originally, because I'd only ever known Marina Warner from when I was at university, and she wrote quite a lot about myths and fairy tales, and particularly sort of some of the tropes and traits within them. So I actually hadn't realised for a really long time that she wrote novels. I sort of only really knew her as sort of a literary critic and whatever. And this book I just thought was really interesting in some ways. It sort of deals with sort of specific time periods around Italy, and it just has this really rich lyrical writing style that really feels like it's sort of tapping into the styles of some of the sort of classical authors, and it has a sort of romance to the way it's written. These beautiful lyrical sentences and descriptions, and just really going into a lot of depth around some of these topics. And this is where I'm trying to remember the characters' names. Yes, so we've got a character, Davide, who is killed. And the sort of family history then follows on, where Anna, in a more kind of modern day situation, is trying to unpick bits of this. So it sort of becomes a sort of historical book of kind of trying to unpick these things. But you've got these different timelines of things all happening. And I struggle with plots like that just because I get lost. But I was just kind of, at least the nice thing with this was I just got to sit back and enjoy the beautiful lyrical style of the book itself. So, yeah, it was just a really beautiful, interesting read. And in some ways, it really stands out on this shortlist for just not being an absurdist a comedic book. It's just one of the few books that's not really intending to be funny. It's just this sort of beautiful lyrical exploration of a sort of family dynamic and family secrets, which I just found really interesting in and of itself. And so that's the shortlist of the 1988 Booker Prize. And yeah, I think, as you can sort of tell, absurdity comes up in such a big way in these books. This is, I think, the thing that's fun with the sort of changing judges year on year, is that often a certain set of tastes will kind of be catered for by certain lists, right? So, you get some lists where it's really about the hard-hitting, sort of big story kind of books, or these big sweeping epics, or lists that really focus a lot more on a dense literary experimental kind of style. Some that are much more accessible, and sort of mainstream fiction. Some like this, where it's sort of a combination of big ideas but with absurdist comedic elements thrown in. And in amongst that, like I said, I think Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda makes sense as a winner in amongst them. I think it does a really good job of balancing some big ideas with this sort of very accessible, fun style of a read, whilst also really not shying away from having proper characterization and sort of in-depth understanding of its characters' psyches. That said, I obviously, as I've gushed about, Penelope Fitzgerald's book, The Beginning of Spring, I just think is exceptional. And it was one of those books where, I read a couple of hers and was like, oh, Penelope Fitzgerald feels like an author for me. I read The Beginning of Spring and just thought, oh, okay, there's something special here. Like, I really like this author. And yeah, I think it kind of speaks a lot to just her skill as an author, how much she's able to do in a relatively short amount of small amount of pages. But that said, I think if any of these books sound like they interest you, I think they deal with some interesting ideas where it's funny, reading them individually, I hadn't necessarily thought too much about some of them or some of the themes. Bringing them all together has kind of given me a slightly different appreciation for how they slot together and how they explore similar topics, often through very different means, or use the same means of kind of absurdity to explore very different things as well. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker, talking about the 1988 Booker shortlist. I will probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, finish the Booker shortlist project this year. So I will be going through the 4s soon, the 4s and the 9s, be 2024, all that kind of jazz. But I'm excited to read some of the other ones as well. This is me catching up from last year with videos, where I just hadn't been able to film the video for this one. But anyway, take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.